The streets of Washington, D.C. were louder than they had been in years. Thousands gathered under banners reading, "No kings, no crowns," their chants echoing through the Capitol like a warning to power itself. Protesters waved flags torn between red, white, and disillusionment. What began as a small movement online, a trending hashtag questioning the president's extended powers, had evolved into a nationwide storm. The No Kings protests weren't just another political outburst. They symbolized a deep, growing anxiety that democracy in America was changing into something unrecognizable. Many fear that the government's expanding authority, from new executive orders to the control of digital speech, was slowly morphing the presidency into a throne. Yet others believed the protesters were overreacting, accusing them of spreading paranoia and chaos. Reporters called it the largest anti-government demonstration since the early 2020s. But unlike earlier protests driven by specific policies, this one was powered by emotion, fear, suspicion, and an almost spiritual resistance to the idea of being ruled. Across cities from Chicago to Phoenix, people held up signs reading, "Freedom isn't a crown gifted by kings," and "Democracy, not dynasty." Social media burned with debate. Supporters of the government argue that the president had done nothing undemocratic, that his extended term was legal, backed by emergency amendments passed during the global crisis years. To them, the protesters were anarchists, unwilling to adapt to a new era of order. But to millions on the streets, the issue wasn't just legality, it was legacy. One protester in New York said into a live camera, "We're not fighting a man, we're fighting a mindset. The moment we start accepting power that never ends, we lose the freedom that made us American." The question hanging in the air was chilling. Were Americans really fighting for freedom or for the illusion of it? In San Francisco, the scene looked almost theatrical. Thousands marching along Market Street, holding cardboard crowns painted black, symbolizing their rejection of authoritarian power. The chants of "No Kings" mixed with the sound of drums, car horns, and helicopters circling overhead. Some protesters wore costumes resembling the Founding Fathers, while others carried digital screens flashing quotes from the Constitution. It was both protest and performance, freedom expressed through chaos. But beneath the noise was something more complex. Many Americans watching from their living rooms weren't sure what to believe. The government insisted it was operating within constitutional bounds, saying that the emergency powers granted during national crises were only temporary, even though those temporary powers had now lasted for years. Political analysts were divided. Some said the protesters misunderstood the law, while others warned that America's democratic traditions were eroding under the weight of unchecked authority. Among the crowd, one woman held a sign that read, "Fear built this country, and fear will destroy it." When asked what she meant, she said softly, "People aren't out here because they love politics. They're here because they're scared. Scared that we'll wake up one day and realize the word freedom doesn't mean anything anymore." Across the country, that fear was palpable. Parents brought their children to protests as a lesson in civic duty, while veterans stood silently with flags folded under their arms. But there was also anger, not just toward the president, but toward fellow citizens who seemed blind to what was happening. The divide was growing deeper than politics. It was moral, emotional, even spiritual. For every person demanding liberty, there was another asking for stability. The same nation that once celebrated rebellion now feared disorder. And that's where the true battle line began to form, not between the government and the people, but between freedom and fear itself. In Chicago, where the No Kings marches had drawn tens of thousands, tensions reached a breaking point. Police lined the streets in riot gear, their faces expressionless behind tinted visors. The air smelled of tear gas and sweat as protesters locked arms chanting, "No man above the law." Overhead, drones streamed live footage that millions watched in real time. It wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a national reckoning broadcast for the world to see. But not everyone agreed on what that reckoning meant. Supporters of the administration argued that these protests were fueled by misinformation, that America's enemies were amplifying division through fake news campaigns. Talk radio hosts mocked the No Kings crowd as keyboard patriots, people who didn't understand the complexities of running a nation under crisis. One viral post read, "You don't save democracy by tearing it apart." Still, to many on the ground, that argument sounded like gaslighting. "They tell us to stay calm while they rewrite the rules," shouted one protest leader in Boston Square. "If freedom is real, it doesn't need permission slips from power." The crowd roared, waving phones that glowed like fireflies in the evening dusk. Religious leaders began weighing in too. Some pastors urged peace, warning their congregations not to let fear turn into rebellion. Others preached that silence was complicity, calling the movement a divine stand against political idolatry. Suddenly, the word ting wasn't just a metaphor. It became a symbol of spiritual corruption, a warning that even democracy could turn sacred power into a weapon. Media networks struggled to keep up. Every channel offered a different version of the truth. To some, it was a protest for liberty. To others, it was the rise of a mob. But the deeper question, the one that haunted every conversation, was this: if both sides claimed to love freedom, why did they define it so differently? It was now a question of identity. What did it mean to be American in an era where freedom itself felt negotiable? Journalists who covered the movement described two kinds of fear. The first was the fear of tyranny, of losing the right to question power, vote freely, or speak one's mind. The second was the fear of chaos, of losing safety, structure, and order. Both sides claimed they were protecting the soul of the nation, and both believed the other was trying to destroy it. The tragedy was that both might have been right in their own ways. In an emotional speech at the National Mall, one young protester said, "We're not fighting kings in crowns anymore. We're fighting kings in suits, kings in offices, kings in our minds." Her words went viral, echoing through millions of phones and televisions. She became the accidental face of a generation that no longer trusted any side completely. The following morning, the president addressed the nation calling for calm. "Freedom," he said, "is not a battlefield. It's a conversation." But to many, that conversation felt one-sided, a speech from the throne disguised as democracy. In the end, the No Kings protests were about more than one man or one administration. They exposed a nation caught between its ideals and its insecurities, between the promise of liberty and the comfort of control, between freedom and fear. And as the chants faded and the flags were folded, America faced its oldest question all over again. Do we want to be free or just feel free? The sun rose over a quiet capital, but the silence didn't mean peace. It meant exhaustion. America had shouted, marched, argued, and cried. The No Kings movement had carved its name into history, not as a revolution, but as a reminder. A reminder that freedom isn't a gift, it's a fight. And sometimes that fight is against ourselves. As cameras packed up and hashtags faded from the trending lists, one thing became clear. The protests were never just about politics. They were about trust, about faith, about whether the people still believed that power could exist without corruption and that liberty could survive without fear. In cafes and classrooms, conversations continued. Some said the movement had gone too far, that chaos only fed the very control it tried to destroy. Others said it hadn't gone far enough, that America was too comfortable with obedience dressed up as order. Between those two voices, the truth trembled, uncertain and fragile. But maybe that's what democracy really is. Not a fixed idea, but a constant struggle, a tug-of-war between those who want freedom and those who want the illusion of it, between the leaders who claim to protect liberty and the citizens who refuse to let them own it. The No Kings protests may have ended, but the question they raised will never die. When does love for your country become fear of your government? And as history keeps repeating its old patterns, one lesson remains. The crown doesn't always sit on a head. Sometimes it hides behind a smile, a flag, or even a law. Because in the end, tyranny doesn't always walk in with boots and banners. Sometimes it slips quietly through the door, wearing the face of democracy itself. So the next time you hear the words "no kings," remember this: it's not just a chant, it's a warning, and it's up to every American to decide whether it's still worth shouting.